The world never fits me. Which is pretty fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, Terry. Terry is one of the three authors that helped to bring my wife and I together, alongside Wendell Berry and Wallace Stegner. So when Terry calls to say, "Do you want to come speak?" you just say yes. So this is my family in about 1981. We were living in Botswana. I love this photo for a variety of reasons. I think these were in many ways the last truly happy years of my mother and father. They loved Africa. And I also love this because we're standing in front of a giant termite mound. And one of the cool things about termites is if you go see this, everybody wants to stand next to it. You can see how big it is. My dad's about my height, and my mom's about 6 foot. She always said she was 5'12". So you can see how tall these are. And we look at it as this great experience of nature. And yet sometimes we have a hesitancy to understand our own cities as nothing more than giant termite mounds. And to me, that's a very freeing feeling because it's a reminder that we actually are part of nature. So I was born in Nebraska. My mom's family are all Czech. My father's from West Virginia, which is why I'm so tall, because I'm not going to make the inbred joke, never mind. And his family had been in West Virginia for about 12 generations. And so being born in Nebraska and moved to Africa at a really young age, one of the things that I think happens is that we root in to the places where we have our first memories. And so that place for me was in Botswana. Now, I'm not of Botswana. I don't have long family ties there, but this is where my memories were rooted. And it was about the age of 4 that we moved to this place. And this is a split of South Dakota. And you can see the Badlands, our West River, with the Black Hills in this very incredibly spiritual place. And you can see the prairie where I just came from actually this morning, which is the rolling prairie of eastern South Dakota. Both places are incredibly beautiful and incredibly wild. One, however, we think of when we think of South Dakota or wild places. But as Willa Cather wrote, anybody can love the mountains. It takes a soul to love the prairie. And truly, I think I am from the prairie, even though I live in Utah now. And it was great to be back home and to be scoured clean by the cold fall, winter air, to also eat far too much walleye and cheese curds and fried food and tater tot casserole. But the hard thing about the prairie and flat places is that rather than seeing them as an opportunity for wilderness and an expression of the human spirit, far too often in humanity, we've seen them as an opportunity for crops. And so the prairie has been destroyed and ripped apart. And one of the things that I think is really important, though, and we can talk a lot about colonialism of land, but one of the real challenges that I think we have in these spaces is as we revert back to wilderness, as we push back to these wild places, what do we do with the people that used to have an economic dependency and a love, even a love-hate relationship with the agriculture or the craft that they participated in over the years? And I think that's one of the challenges, and we're witnessing that in Terry and I's home state of Utah now, in southeastern Utah, where so many people were so frightened of a wilderness designation around Bears Ears. And sometimes I wonder, and have had conversations, were they frightened because it was going to lead to increased visitation? Were they frightened because it meant that they couldn't have jobs any longer, jobs in the oil and gas industry, and especially when I look at mining, right? Coal mining, even if we bring back coal mining, like West Virginia is still going to be in the lower 5% when it comes to GDP, right? It's always been a rough, difficult, we've treated as a third world bastardized cousin of the rest of America. So will coal mining bring it back? Well, maybe not, but one of the things that I always found interesting in coal mining and a lot of the extractive industries is there's community there. There's community in that suffering. There's community in going through something together, and we value hard work, right? And I think that's always a weird thing because there's a lot of really horrible people out there who've done horrible things that are incredibly hard workers, right? You can't take away from their work ethic. So we've got to figure out how we value work ethic and what they do. And in a place like Moab, which has been replaced, we've gone away from uranium mining, and now people are selling t-shirts. And is there dignity in that? And when we think about the outdoor industry and we think about that, are we just as extractive as that mining evidence because we've gone to it? The outdoor industry is a multi-billion-dollar affair, right? But that multi-billion-dollar affair isn't in Blanding or Bluff, Utah. And so as happy as I was to see brands like Patagonia come out strong in support of public lands, I was pretty frustrated that Patagonia demanded that they kept all their economics and all their manufacturing and their corporate headquarters in Ventura, California. Because if you believe so much that you're willing to invest millions in dollars of advertising campaigns, then come to Bluff, right? And come to know these types of things in these places. So I grew up in South Dakota. I joined the military. I left the military. I thought I had a picture in here. I was a drum major at my high school. I thought that picture made it in here, but it didn't. I left the military in 2004. I did landmine clearance. This is me with my very first landmine. Landmine clearance, by the way, is a very boring job until it isn't. I went from Angola to the former Soviet state of Georgia. This is Abkhazia. On the other side of these mountains is Sochi, which you may remember from the Winter Olympics. This is an incredibly beautiful place. What's really fascinating about the Caucasus and spending time in the Caucasus Mountain region is it made me think a lot when I was there about the way we think of tribe, right? And in America, we typically divide ourselves up into native and non-native, right? That's one way we can split ourselves up. But when I was in the Caucasus, it came to me because people looked like me. They were relatively white. The Caucasus are one of the few places where I can blend in with the general population, the other one being, Norway. But what it came to me there, it was a reminder that we all used to be indigenous, that we all used to be native to somewhere. And one of the things that I think is happening that's so violent to all of us is that there are multiple layers between our feet, our souls, and our rituals now in the land and the environment, especially for European Americans and African Americans who are wrenched from their soil through slavery. We don't know where we are from unless you have deep cultural roots. Even my dad, who's been in West Virginia 7 years, or for 7 generations, and just recently returned, or 12 generations, does not know the name of the stream. He calls it Turkey Creek. I know that that's not the name of that stream, if it even had a name. And sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on place names and too much emphasis on these locations, right? I mean, Canada is the Iroquois word for village, right? And so somebody showed up and was like, where are we? And you can imagine the Iroquois looking around and going, Canada? It's a village, right? And now we call the whole country that. And it's the same thing I was saying earlier. Did you know that the Dakota are the smallest of the 3 large federations of the Sioux tribe? But because they were at that intersection where Sioux City now stands, a lot of your sausage and bacon comes from Sioux City, by the way, they were the Dakota. So all of a sudden we have the Dakota Territory. And if you're in Dakota or Lakota, you gotta be pissed off, right? Because it's like, you guys screwed over our land, you gave us these blankets full of smallpox, and now we're forced to live in the Dakotas. We're the Dakota, we're the Lakota people. So we've even screwed up how we do our naming. But I think because of that, we're broken, right? We're cut off. So where do we go from sustenance? And in the military, one of the things I learned is you gotta keep your supply train, right? The only way to make a war work is to be attached to your supply train, but that's with everything. And I think we're cut off from that spiritual sustenance. So right before, in Abkhazia, I got recalled to the United States military to serve in Iraq, and right before I went, I got to spend about 10 days in Bujagali Falls in Uganda. I actually had no idea where you were from when I started this, but this was a beautiful place. And even then, when I was there, people were mourning the coming passing of Bujagali Falls because of a hydroelectric power plant that was coming to take over there. And it's another place where we're cut off. And what does that mean for the people of Uganda? What does that mean for the people of the world who could have gone and seen the power of this very, very special place? And even there, in a nominally Christian country, many people spoke to me about the spirits of the forest and the spirits of the water. And where do those spirits go when they can't play? And I think Bujagali Falls might have been the place where I learned most the power of joy and the power of play. Because from there, I went to war. This is me in Baghdad. I weighed about 300 pounds when I was in Baghdad. I wasn't a very heavy guy. That's what I dressed in most days. I had a Kevlar helmet as well. I carried a small automatic rifle that in my hands looked like a small pistol. I had smoke grenades. Oftentimes I carried the large squad automatic weapon. Even though I was the team leader, I was the biggest person there, and I was typically the first person to kick down a door if that was necessary. And my job there was to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people. We were there to help. I walked into an orphanage one day, knocked on the door, and a woman in perfect English said to me, "Oh, are you here to check out the weapons of mass destruction in my basement?" So I just smiled and said, "Yes." So I got back from Iraq. I moved to Philadelphia. I used to joke the reason I moved to Philadelphia is because I wanted an easy transition from a war zone to back home. I was talking about Eagles games, not the socioeconomic status of the city. I got home. I went to South Africa first, surfing for a few days, about 3 weeks. Went to Israel, Lebanon, back to Europe. And one of the things that struck me when I was there was that I missed the adrenaline of war. So I started a cocaine habit. And I tell you, and I got into the University of Pennsylvania, I couldn't get into Harvard. But one of the great things about the Ivy League schools, right, is how easy it is to get a student loan once you're there. And Citibank does not care what you pay for that. And so for my 2 years in Philadelphia, I think I could have gotten a small economic development award for a village in Bolivia for the amount of cocaine that I went up my nose. And I was really just trying to replicate the stoke and this weird, frustrated, corrupted awe that happens in war. And I wanted to kill myself when I got home. And I wanted to kill myself when ultimately I moved out to Colorado. And my buddy Chuck said to me, "Put off suicide for a couple weeks and come on out rock climbing." And I thought, I mean, at the end of the day, if I'm going to commit suicide, I can wait now or I can wait in 2 weeks. And I don't mean to necessarily joke about suicide, but for me, humor is one of the only ways that I can get through this. And I've lost a lot of friends, and I know probably many people here have lost a lot of friends to suicide and death. And it's one of the things, if nothing else out of this conversation that you take away, please just call it death by suicide. Because I've begun to see suicide as a disease, and I've begun to see much of what we can do around suicide as hospice care. And I don't want to ever say that anybody was weak in their suicide. In the same way that we would never say after somebody passed cancer they didn't fight hard enough or they didn't try hard enough. That's bullshit. We're all going to go out of this world at some point. And sometimes people die by suicide, and sometimes it's a car accident or cancer or war. And sometimes war never leaves you. And one of the things I learned when I was spending time outside, because at first when I came home, I was really angry. And I didn't think anybody else could understand my anger unless they too had served in a war zone. And over time, what I realized through the outdoors, because in the outdoors, right, it doesn't matter if it rains, it doesn't matter if it's hot outside and what your socioeconomic preferences or religion or sexual or gender are. That's the wonderful thing about nature, right? And that's, I think, the fear that so many cities and leaders have with us is they don't want us to experience this place where really equality and liberty and justice happen. So it's easier to keep us all inside. But I began to realize that other people who had never been to war were warriors. And I began to realize that other people who had never seen what I had seen had trauma. And one of the things with that, too, is that I want to really talk about here briefly is that I am your veteran in this country. I'm yours. I signed up nominally on your behalf. And when I come home, whether or not you agree with the war or not, I'm still yours. I'm your tax burden. And so if you want to thank a veteran in a way that moves us beyond war, use our public lands. Fight for our public lands. And I realize that can be a unique concept here in New England. But you have plenty of public lands. Get out and use them for your own health. And if nothing else, the next time you go, be like, you know what? This one's for Stacy. So I started climbing, met lots of kids, learned about generalized versus acute trauma. Nature helps with both. Wanted to put some scientific data behind it, which is kind of horse crap because we know from all our spiritual traditions, right, that nature's pretty cool. That's how we can access the divine. Buddha's sitting under a tree, Jesus does the Sermon on the Mount, Moses goes to the top of the mountain. One of the cool things about all those stories too is there's always a little bit of suffering, right? It's not like Moses took like an easy walk up that mountain. He had to really work it after 40 years out in the wild. After that, I made the decision that it was time to start going back to these places, that I could come up with some level of engagement to help rewrite or add to my narrative, not change my narrative, because I think it's important to remember pain and hurt. And I think it's okay to be hurt and painful. And I think it's okay to remember that even if the rest of you and the rest of the world is going through really hard times, it doesn't mean that you don't give a shit if you're having fun yourself. Just don't always have fun, right? Put some effort into it. You can be an optimist and still be mad as hell, and still be frustrated, and still be afraid, and still be an optimist. So Alex Honnold and I went back to Angola. Moments before this picture was taken, I tried to do the whole Lion King thing with him. It was about 1 of 4 times I nearly killed Alex, but I'm not allowed to use that photo. Then I came home from Angola, and we were lucky enough that my wife and I had this little person join us in the world. This is my daughter, Wilder. And this is one of the reasons where I am incredibly optimistic about the future, because there couldn't be this much sheer joy in the world if there wasn't a chance. And after that, because of the encouragement of my amazing partner, she said it's time for you to go back to Iraq. So I found a couple buddies, and this is us skiing in Iraq. And that's me with a mustache doing my best impersonation of a highway patrolman. It's my buddy Griff in the middle and our friend Robin on the right. Iraq is this incredible, incredible place. This is Kurdistan, but it's still technically within the international boundaries of Iraq. And one of the reasons we went there was because we wanted people to see more to this country and more to the narrative than is normally seen in typical disaster and war reporting. I actually have no idea where I'm at with time. 4 more minutes, all right. So one of the things, I have a mild traumatic brain injury that impacts my executive functioning. I typically start a conversation with that, but I don't do it. If we're climbing together, I'll wait until you're just about ready to start climbing, and then I'll remind you of that. But I think, when we think about how this communicates and connects to all these things, the other thing that I think is really important to remember, the spirituality of it all. And I've said this to a few folks today. Regardless of your religious beliefs, or lack thereof, or your beliefs in science, one of the things that seems to be most agreed upon is that we are made out of mud. We came from the mud, we were formed out of the mud, and at some level that mud came from on high. It came from a voice of God, which if you ever get to hear Yusuf Kumunyaka speak, he's an incredible poet. That's what God will sound like. I think James Earl Jones is more St. Peter. No offense. And we know that that mud came from that celestial being or from stars. And at some level, that's what we all get to return to, is that same glorious mud, those same glorious stars. And in that is this kernel of beastliness, which is so good. So I encourage you all to find that beast and be that beast. And one of the things that Terry's husband, Brooke, who's also an incredible individual, and I think has lived on this earth for thousands of years, is the true incarnation of Puck. He wrote in a book called, Open Midnight? He talked about Cain and Abel. And for some reason in this country, and I bring this up because we're at a divinity school, God favored Abel because he wasn't civilizing. He wasn't cultivating. And yet, 6,000 years on, if you believe that time frame, Cain has been winning. And no wonder we're so sad and so angry and frustrated as a world. We weren't meant to cultivate. We were meant for joy. We were meant to play in the mud. And I encourage you all to find some time to do that. And there's all sorts of other things I could talk about the experience of awe and how this has real value to your health and the science behind that. But science doesn't seem to be moving the conversation right now. But I really think playing in the mud can. Thank you so much for having me out tonight.